Oji Rose, and today we're going to be talking about Socrates, the simple, and locating. And the main idea, we've had a few pieces on Socrates, like the Socratic Embodiment. And in that piece, we argue that we have to think about what Socrates is doing as not merely as a method, but he's embodied, he's in the streets, he's facing people as he makes them realize they have no idea what they mean by justice and goodness and so on and so forth. So Socrates is doing something that's not just the work of a head on a stick per se, but the work of somebody who's in the streets with people. In this piece, I want to draw attention to another way why I think the Socratic method can be a problematic thing to emphasize in Socrates, even if there's legitimacy to it. I think, first off, often the method is seen basically as just teaching debate. If I debate with you and go back and forth, then that's kind of what we think is Socratic, and certainly I think this is what colleges can teach. Yeah, they can say, no, the Socratic method is asking questions, but you see in today's world where asking questions is seen as an aggressive act, an act of attack, then asking questions is debate. So that, that faulty conflation then leads to seeing the Socratic method as the teaching of debate. I think it's very problematic. Something that I think we need to see Socrates is doing is making us realize that basically nothing is simple. It seems like things are simple, but nothing is. Like if someone asks me, how are you doing today? And I'm saying, I'm good, I'm having a good day. Well, the person could say, well, what do you mean by good? And suddenly, in an all at once, with a very simple question, I can realize that a term like good requires a whole network of premises, of ideas, of notions that I perhaps have never thought about. Now, that doesn't mean I'm wrong when I say that today is a good day, but even a term like good requires just a host of notions to work through and think about to even approach what the term might mean. And so even saying it's a good day is not so simple. We talk about justice, freedom, democracy, all these things all the time, and don't even realize that we don't know what these terms mean. And that's what Socrates is helping us work through. And yet today there's so many people who's like, it's simple, freedom is good, it's simple, don't make it complicated. There's this emphasis on not making things complicated, more complicated than they need be. And this is not all wrong. There is something to be said about don't make things unnecessarily complex. But there's also a problem with making things simple that aren't simple, because what's the difference between being simple and being a simpleton? It's not so clear. And the moment that question right there would require thinking, right? This effort reminds me of Derrida, who wanted to make it clear that we don't just read books, we interpret them. Derrida can be seen as deconstructing everything in a nihilistic sense, but I think Derrida is just opening us up to the reality that nobody just reads, that we're always already interpreting. And that's very, very consequential, because it adds a little bit of humility and openness to the text and other that we might not otherwise bring to the table, because we're so sure that we're just reading the book. But we're always already engaged in interpretation. So likewise for Socrates, we're always already engaged in something that isn't simple, this thing called life. So life, again, there's something about the idea that don't make things unnecessarily complicated, but we'll have to get into that. But things are not simple. If you say just do your job, well, why? And what constitutes a job? I can be at home digging holes all day, but that wouldn't necessarily be a job. That might just be meaningless toil. So we have to get into all of these things. If I say, just be a good person, well, what does it mean to be a good person? Or just do what's right, or just take care of your family, or just have savings, or whatever. What constitutes too little savings? What constitutes a good amount of savings? Take care of the family in what terms? Spiritual, economic? There's a million things that has to go into. So nothing is simple. And yet, strangely, it seems like it is. Doesn't it seem like it's simple? Be a good person. It's not hard. Just be a good person. And here, I think what we can start to explore is why the notion of just be simple is so seemingly true. And I think it's because we're confusing ideas with apprehension. And what I mean by that is when I look at a bookcase, I apprehend that's a bookcase. I don't really have to think about it. I just apprehend it. You just apprehend a cat or an onion. And it is simple. I don't need anything else but the raw apprehension to know that's a bookcase, or to apprehend that's a bookcase. It's a simple thing. And by simple, we mean there's no composite parts. There's no additional parts or extensions you need to know that's a bookcase. And simple in the sense of it's just given. It's immediate. Here's the issue. The moment, though, I ask, the moment I try to understand my apprehension. Now I've moved into the realm of ideas, and ideas are not simple because ideas always require other ideas to be defined and understood. They're always extending, like Derrida's difference. And so ideas are not simple. They're always expanding, because if I say, well, what is a bookshelf? Well, it holds books. Notice I'm now talking about books, something other than bookshelf in a Hegelian sense. Okay, well, why is a bookshelf something that holds books? Because can a bookshelf hold guns? Or, a lot of people will use it to hold pictures or other objects. And you would go, oh, maybe. So, okay, well, if I use a bookcase to hold pictures, isn't it a picture case? Blah, 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 right? So the issue is the initial apprehension of a thing is simple, but my understanding of my apprehensions are not. And this is the issue. When I hear the phrase, be a good person, all ideas, you could argue, start with an apprehension of the meaning of the phrase, be a good person. I apprehend the phrase just suddenly and all at once. But if I try to understand the phrase, now it's moved into complexity, but since I initially apprehended it, it just seems like it's simple. And if I try to understand it beyond that initial apprehension, then I'm being difficult. But here's the thing. Apprehensions are simple, but ideas are not. Understanding is not simple. Ideas are complex because you have to define and work through and think through. But because apprehensions are simple, it's easy to think ideas should be simple or are simple because we conflate them with apprehensions. And if we can apprehend the world so easily, why can't we understand the world just as easily? And so there comes to be a kind of oughtness where we ought to be able to understand the world just as simply as we understand it. And that leads to trouble. So we conflate understanding and apprehension, phenomenological apprehension, with mental understanding. And mental understanding is not simple. But there's also perhaps an ideological move here, because if we realize that ideas are not simple, well, then we'd have to think about them, and then we'd have to think about our worldview, and that could hurt our worldview and ideology, and that's also existentially uncomfortable. So there might be a psychological and existential incentive to make this conflation as well. Now, this brings us to the last main topic of the work, which is on locating, and this came up with my wonderful talk with Matthew Allison, where we talked about how metaphysics is increasingly locating the apathetic. Matthew put that very well in the target. So where do we locate the apathetic or the lack or these kind of present absences in reality? Now that's going to require a lot. We also talked about that if you don't rightly locate mystery in your life, you're going to end up with the ever meta. But so I really enjoyed that talk, and I'll let listeners listen to it when it comes out. But there's this idea that reality requires us to locate things more so than respond to it. Like, where am I going to locate this chair in my life? And that's kind of like a way to think about things now, and it's going to fit more with the geometry of Leibniz. But the point is that if I say something like life is simple, I do think that's a true statement, but it depends on where we locate it. Do we locate the statement life is simple in like how we live our lives practically, or do we locate life is simple in the realm of thought? If we locate in the realm of thought, then I think we're going to be in trouble, because I would argue that it requires a lot of complex and deep thinking to live a simple life. This would also get you into David Hume's self-defense, philosophical self-defense, as I'll talk about in defending common life and returning to common life. And so if we locate life as simple in the realm of thought, then we might have simple thinking. And I would actually argue that simple thinking leads to a whole lot of drama and a whole lot of trouble. We end up in a not simple life, in a complex life. We, for example, accept the premises of the zeitgeist, which Ivan Illich critiques, and we have that class coming up at Parallax on that, on Ivan Illich. And, we're simple in thought, and so end up with a complex life. So we actually have to locate the simplicity in the practical everyday experience and try to live simple lives. But that actually requires complex thinking, deep thinking, as David Hume understood. And so we have a true premise, but where we locate it makes all the difference. And if we mislocate it, we're going to end up with trouble. And this also brings to mind St. Augustine on order and the importance of order, where evil is a misordered good. So how do we order creation so that it is more good than bad? Like if I have the premise, it's good to focus on art, but I locate that premise in a realm that makes art, say, capitalist architecture that's not very aesthetically pleasing, then I'm going to be using a truth that, art is good to actually defend a problematic modern aesthetic, for example, that maybe is dehumanizing. because bad architecture can be dehumanizing, as Christopher Alexander will talk about. So there's all these ideas of these various, it's good to make a living, but if I locate that in a professionalism that removes time energy, as David talks about, or that makes me a servant of the professional class, as Ivan Illich will talk about, then this true premise then comes to serve a falsity or something bad. So it's not simply enough to be able to rightly identify a premise as true. There's then the whole question of where do we locate that true premise in our life, and within what other premises do we locate it. And this is a practice we won't even think we need to realize unless we first accept what Socrates teaches us, which is that nothing is simple. Nothing in thought and understanding is simple. Realizing that, then we can begin learning all of these mental and intellectual practices that are so important. And then I think it's just really important to realize that I think these practices, realizing that life is not simple, then results in people formulating their minds and lives in a manner that makes them more susceptible and more open to friendship, because they're more open to the other. There's this great irony in which it seems a lot of people say life is simple, and it sounds very humble and open to other people. But actually, if you say life is simple, then you have to judge what is simple, and you have to judge things as complex versus not. And so you become more judgmental. Like, this emphasis on simplicity leads to higher levels of judgmentalism. You also have to judge what is complex to preserve your ideology. And if you're closed off to complexity, then you have to be able to judge a threat to that closed offness. And so actually simplicity can lead to a higher level of judgmentalism and actually hurt humility. Whereas complexity doesn't need judgment, it just needs assessment. That's complex, so you're assessing the complexity that you know you can never fully grasp, and you actually then become humbler and more open to the other people. So there's an irony here where simplicity can lead to more judgmentalism and complexity can lead to more openness. And yet one of the reasons people tend to defend simplicity is because they want us to get back to what matters, friendship, life, not to get lost in ideas all the time. But in fact, that emphasis can lead to the loss of our ability to properly relate and defend what matters. And so that's an irony that I think is very widespread. It's not the case that if we try to be simple in understanding, we'll necessarily protect and focus on what matters better. In fact, it could be the complete opposite. The complexity and depth of thought could be the precondition of what we need to be open to other people. And again, we think of Alan Bloom at the end of the Closing the American Mind on this idea that the philosophical life and the humanities are a necessary precondition for friendship. And if that's the case, then we might be using ideas of simplicity and thought in the name of relationships, which is precisely what makes relationships less likely to form and friendship harder to maintain and prove open to. For more about OG Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, so forth and so on. We also have our class at Parallax involving Ivan Illich. And thank you so much for your time.